So you want to play Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, but every video explaining it assumes you already know some of what's going on. Well, look no further, because you're about to learn everything you need to know to play Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition. This video is mainly meant to teach new players how to play the game, rather than teach new Dungeon Masters how to run the game. Before we get started, you'll need a few things, namely dice sets, books, and a method of organizing your game. Don't worry, all of these things can be found online for free. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, we use a variety of different dice to determine randomness in the game. The one you're probably most familiar with is a 6-sided die, or a d6. It looks like a cube. But in Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, we need to be able to use a d4, a d6, a d8, d10, d12, d20, and a percent die, but a percent die is just another d10. I'd recommend buying your dice sets from a local hobby shop. However, there's plenty of virtual dice rollers online for free. You can even just Google it. Next, the most important thing you're going to need is the DnD Fifth Edition Player's Handbook, or PHB for short. There's a PDF of this available all over the place for free if you just Google it. Personally, I greatly prefer the online version because it allows me to use the Control F command to search through the entire book instantly just by typing. Character building starts on page 45 of the PHB. We'll get into that later in this video. Last but certainly not least, you're going to need some kind of tabletop for you and your group to meet at, either just meeting in person on a literal table, easy peasy, or using a virtual tabletop like Roll20, which is free to use, or Tailspire, which costs money but is way cooler. I'm not going to go into how to use those programs in this video because that's beyond the scope of this discussion. I might do that in a future video. Before we get started on anything else, a few things need to be stated about playing tabletop games before you can start. First and foremost, the Dungeon Master's word is final. Whatever they say goes, because they're the person running the game. They have a lot of work to do. Please just try and be nice to them. Secondly, communicate with your table and tell them what you're comfortable with and what expectations you have of the game. Communication is unimaginably important in a game like this. Finally, don't forget about the rule of cool. The rule of cool just means that you and your table having fun goes before the rules as they are written in the PHB. After all, if you and the people at your table aren't having fun, what's the point of playing? So, do whatever you want as long as your table is okay with it. In this part of the video, I'm going to go over all the basics of making any character sheet. Then afterwards, I'm going to make 2 different characters and bring them up to level 3, starting at level 1, from start to finish. There are plenty of variations of the D&D 5th Edition character sheets. However, I'll be working with the simplest one, which is just the one from the starter set, since they all have essentially the exact same information inside of them. Starting at the top of the page, we have a lot of basic information that needs to be filled out, like your character's name, your personal name, and a few other details about your character. You can basically ignore alignment since it has no bearing on how you play the game. It's just meant to be a storytelling device. It's that old slider of good versus evil and lawful versus chaotic that your character can fall on. However, it's a rather antiquated system in my opinion, and many people share that same sentiment, so I essentially just don't use it. The first thing you're going to need to do is look at your stats. These are going to be the bread and butter of how you play the game. First there's strength, followed by dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. There are multiple different ways to determine the stats your character is going to have. Some involve rolling dice, others don't. The version that I prefer to use is called point buy. Essentially, your character's stats all start out at a minimum of 8 and cannot go lower, and you can spend points to get them as high as 15, and you can't go higher. You have a total of 27 points to spend however you please. However, this is done before adding racial bonuses and other bonuses, so you can still get your stats higher than 15, and they usually cap out around 18. When choosing a race, their page will usually elaborate on what racial bonuses they get for their stats. For example, humans get a +1 to every one of their stats, whereas other races usually get a +2 and a +1 to 2 specific stats. This makes humans pretty popular. Once you've finalized your stats, it's time to figure out what kind of modifier they're going to give you. A modifier is a number that tells you how much your stat is going to assist with your rolls. For example, if your strength stat is a 12, you have a +1 modifier for it, and thus whenever you roll for strength in any given category, you'll have a minimum of a +1 assisting that roll. To determine the modifier for one of your stats, start by looking at the number 10. Then determine how far away your stat is from 10. To give an example, the number 14 is 4 points away from 10. Of course, it's simple subtraction. For every 2 points distance from the number 10, your modifier will change by +1 or -1. So, in increments of 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, you'll gain a +1 for every 2 points in your skill. A 10 in your stat block will produce a modifier of 0, but an 11 will also produce a modifier of 0. You'll only get the +1 once you increment twice. However, when your score first drops beneath 10, you immediately get a -1 to your modifier. This is only true for when you reach 9, and it isn't true for the other stats. After 9, your modifier will continue to decrease by 1 when you hit 6, 4, 2, and 0 is not a stat you can have in standard D&D 5th edition. Hey folks, if I suddenly sound a few weeks older, that's because this is editing Makeshift. I fucked up the numbers there. Just look at that table on screen. Those numbers are correct. Now that you have all of your base stats established after character creation, it's time for us to start recording everything else on the character sheet, starting with saving throws. This is going to be very easy. All you need to do is write down your modifier in the space next to the matching name. Strength gets your strength modifier, dexterity gets your dexterity modifier, and so on. Later on in the video, you're going to see that 2 of these skills in the saving throws are going to be bubbled with that dot that's sitting next to them. Those are meant to mark your proficiencies, and they're unique to each class. Speaking of proficiency, there's a stat on the character sheet called Proficiency Bonus. This is something that every character has, and literally every single class starts out with a +2 as their proficiency bonus. This won't go up until I think about level 5, so we don't need to worry about that now. Next we need to fill out the information for your skills. This is going to be very similar to the saving throws. Simply take the modifier from your base stats and write them down next to the skill that they correspond to. You should see parentheses with a word like Dex or Wiz next to each of the skills that determines which modifier you should write down next to it. Then, just like your saving throws, you're going to mark down your proficiencies by filling in the bubble next to the skills that you have proficiency in. We'll get into which ones you get to bubble out later on in the video. Beneath your skills, you should see a bar that's labeled Passive Perception or Passive Wisdom. This is calculated by taking 10 and adding your modifiers for wisdom to it, including proficiency. It's usually only used by the DM if they want to surprise certain players with an encounter. However, I don't see it used particularly often, so this is one of those stats you don't have to worry too much about, but talk to your Dungeon Master about it. Moving to the middle of the sheet, it's time to calculate the armor class. Unarmored defense is equal to 10 plus your dexterity modifier. To get a better armor class for most players, you'll need to be wearing armor. To wear any type of armor, light, medium, or heavy, you'll need to have proficiency in that type of armor. When wearing armor, it changes that base 10 stat. Doesn't change any modifiers or add new ones. Your character's class will tell you which types of armor you have proficiency in. Your initiative is a number that gets added on to your combat roll at the start of combat. It's the roll that determines who gets to go first in combat. The higher roll goes first, the lowest roll goes last. Initiative is just your dexterity modifier. For most races and classes, your speed is 30 feet of movement or 6 spaces, but the shorter races will have 25 feet. Check and see whichever race you pick. It will specify how much movement you have, as well as the fact that some features have the ability to improve your movement speed, but features are beyond the scope of this discussion. Hit points are your character's health in D&D 5th Edition. To determine your hit points, roll your hit dice and add your Constitution modifier each time you level up in that class. Each time you level up in Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, you gain another hit dice from the class that you level up in. If you take 2 levels in Barbarian, you have 2 Barbarian hit dice. In that case, you would have 2d12s, the largest hit die in the game. However, when you level up for another time, you won't be rolling all of your hit dice at the same time, just one new hit die, to determine how much health you gain when you level up. Personally, I prefer to just take the average and add the Constitution modifier. It's usually better because it's the median plus 1. So for the Barbarian's hit die, instead of rolling a d12 and writing down whatever number I land on, I would just take 6 plus 1, which is 7, and add that to my total health pool, plus my Constitution modifier. At later levels, when you get stat increases, if you choose to increase Constitution as one of your stats, it will retroactively increase the amount of health you've gotten based on the number of levels you have. So if my Constitution modifier goes from a plus 2 to a plus 3, I will look at the number of levels that I have, let's say 3 levels total now, and I'm going to add hit points for all the times that I would have had the extra plus 1 health to my Constitution. Outside of leveling up, hit dice do still serve a purpose in gameplay. Specifically when your characters take a short rest, they're able to spend hit dice by rolling them and regain that amount of health to their hit points. Speaking of resting, a short rest in D&D 5th Edition is 1 hour, where your character spends lounging around and maybe taking a nap or having something to eat. A long rest in D&D 5th Edition is more akin to a night of sleep. It takes 8 hours and you regain all your HP, and as the rules are written, half of the total hit dice rounded up. At lower levels, just regain all of your hit dice. That rule is kind of a drag, and it just slows down the game. In combat, when your character drops to 0 HP, on your next turn, you'll roll a d20 as part of a death save. Death saving throws work as follows. A 10 or above when rolling a d20 is a success. A 9 or below is a failure. If you roll 3 successes, your character is now stable. They do not regain HP. They are still unconscious, but they aren't going to die. If you roll 3 failures, your character is dead right then and there. Nothing's bringing them back. It's important to remember that if you roll a 1 on a death saving throw, that counts as a critical failure, and it counts as 2 failures rather than 1. Conversely, if you roll a 20 on a death saving throw, that's a critical success, and your character regains consciousness with 1 HP. Personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws don't have any mechanical purpose in D&D 5th Edition, but they do help you remember how your character behaves to improve the storytelling of your various campaigns. In my experience, flaws are definitely the most interesting, but more importantly is that you have your character change over long periods of time or even short periods of time. It makes stories far more interesting. In the box beneath those, you'll see a section called Features. Features are very unique gameplay mechanics that each individual character can customize to themselves. They're rather complicated and there's so many of them that I definitely won't be able to go over all of them in just this video, but if you look up a video about all of the best features, there's plenty that exist that can help you build your character and design them to be better at combat or whatever story you're interested in telling. Lastly, for this segment of the video is leveling up. I'm only going to briefly talk about this because I'm going to go into much more detail coming up next, but essentially what occurs is you get stat bonuses, more HP, and various other things. But specifically when you reach level 3 is when your character really develops their personality and combat abilities, because that's when most classes get to pick their subclass. More about that in a minute. In this section of the video, I'm going to make 2 characters. First, I'm going to make a barbarian, and then I'm going to make a druid character. Conceptually speaking, barbarians are the simplest class in the game. However, this doesn't necessarily make them the easiest class to play. They have a lot of health, they deal a lot of damage, and they can take a lot of damage. And that's basically the entire concept of barbarians. Before I begin making this character, a quick note about storytelling and flavoring your characters. Barbarians are typically known for being muscle-headed and not very intelligent, which, mechanically speaking, is true. Their intelligence is very typically quite low to the point where most of them can't even read. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to act stupid or non-strategic as a barbarian. Hell, even with an intelligence stat of only 4, you could still say that your barbarian is a scientist whose just only specialty is marine biology, and they just get enraged when they don't understand other concepts outside of marine biology. So you can really have fun with how you want to play your character. Don't let your stats tell you how to be that character or portray them. Those stats just tell you the mechanics of how your character works. Now, without further ado, let's get started on making this barbarian. On page 47 of the player's handbook, you'll see a section in bold text labeled Class Features. This is a great point to begin making your character at. Right after Class Feature, we can see a series of bolden texts that say hit dice, hit points at first level, and hit points at higher levels. So for a barbarian, we would get a 1d12 for every barbarian level we take as our hit dice. Then our hit points will be 12 plus your constitution modifier when you first take a level in barbarian. Then after that first level, each time you gain a level, roll a d12 or use 7 plus your constitution modifier to gain more HP every single level. Next, as a barbarian, are the proficiencies. For armor, you get light armor, medium armor, and shields as proficiency. For weapons, you get simple weapons, martial weapons, and that's all for your proficiency in weapons. When you have proficiency in something, in the case of armor, it means that you're able to use it in the first place. But in the case of weapons, it just means that you're allowed to add your proficiency bonus to them. Later on in the video, we'll talk more about adding proficiency bonus and determining damage when in combat, but for now let's continue on with the barbarian. As our saving throws for a barbarian, we get strength and constitution, meaning that those will get a +2 on our character sheet. Then for skills, we can choose 2 from the list as follows: animal handling, athletics, intimidation, nature, perception, and survival. Whichever 2 of these you think would suit your character best are the ones I'd recommend using, although the ones that usually come up most often are things like athletics and perception. Although don't discount all the other ones, they have their place in storytelling and gameplay mechanics. Next, we're going to choose the equipment we get from taking a level in a new class, in addition to the equipment that we got from our background. I didn't talk about the background earlier, but your background as a character is mostly a storytelling device and occasionally grants you either a small amount of money, gives you certain plot hooks for storytelling purposes, or gives you very minor and situational features which aren't really worth going over when it comes to basics. Just know that most people usually choose soldier for martial classes or hermit, or it doesn't really matter all that much, so don't worry too much about that. Just for simplicity on this character, I'm going to say that they pick a great axe as their first piece of equipment, a dagger as their second piece of equipment for the simple weapon, and 4 javelins because I don't really care too much about the explorer's back. Also at first level for barbarians, we get their most iconic ability called Rage. When activated, it gives them advantage on all strength checks and strength saving throws, additional damage on all melee attacks, and resistance to all physical damage. Rage is one of those abilities that simply has its own number of uses, separate from everything else. It just has 2 uses per day at level 1, and that increases over time as you level up. They also get a very useful ability called Unarmored Defense. While you're not wearing any armor, your armor class equals 10 plus your dexterity modifier plus your constitution modifier. You can use a shield and gain this benefit. After leveling up and gaining more health, barbarians also gain an ability called Reckless Attack. This allows them to gain advantage on any of their melee attacks, but it will also allow anybody who's against them to get advantage on their attacks. We'll go more into advantage later on in this video. They also get an ability called Danger Sense, which just allows them to have advantage on skill saves when avoiding traps that they can see. Not all that useful in the time that I've used it. When Barbarians reach level 3, they get to pick something called a Primal Path. This is basically their subclass, and other classes get them either sooner or a bit later, but this is about the time when most classes are going to get their subclass. For simplicity, I'm going to make this Barbarian choose Path of the Berserker. This path isn't really all that good when you consider some of the stipulations of it later on, and I'll get into that in a moment. What this path allows you to do at 3rd level is enter a frenzy whenever you're in rage, and as you're in a frenzy, it allows you to make an extra regular attack using your bonus action, and I'll get more into bonus actions later on in the video. The very large downside of this is that once you leave the frenzied state, you gain a level of what's called exhaustion, and exhaustion is something that very, very quickly causes a lot of problems. It cuts your movement in half, gives you disadvantage on other skill checks, and when you get 6 levels of it, you just die, and it's kind of hard to remove without a long rest. So it's best to just pick the Totem Warrior, which I won't go into this video. You can just read up on that yourself. Now that we've read through how to make a Barbarian up to level 3, I'm going to breeze through the Druid rather quickly, since you should know how to read this at this point. For this character, instead of making it a human, I'm going to make it a half-elf, which means they're going to get a +2 to their charisma, and a +1 to 2 other stats. Like other casters, Druid get both cantrips and 1st level spell slots at their 1st level. One unique thing about Druids, and by extension clerics as well, is that they don't have a list of spells that they know because they have access to all of their spells. It's just a matter of which spells do they prepare for each day. More about that later on. One important thing to remember is that a cantrip is a level 0 spell, which means you can use them as many times in a day as you want, without any need for spell slots. Leveled spells, on the other hand, are different. They require what's called a spell slot to be used. At 1st level with Druid, you have 2 1st level spell slots available for use each day, or per long rest. Refer to page 65 on the PHB for the Druid spellcasting table. Now, in the case of Druids and Clerics, you don't really have to worry too much about picking your spells right when you level up, because you can pick new spells whenever you want. However, other classes have more permanent fixtures on their spells, so if you're planning on playing a different caster, be sure to think about what spells you want to use. Starting at 2nd level is when Druids gain their subclass, specifically their Druid Circle, and also an ability called Wild Shape. Wild Shape can be very fun and extremely useful in many different situations in D&D 5th Edition, so be sure to read up on it and look into the CR ratings of various monsters they can turn into. A Druid's Druid Circle allows them to gain access to unique spells that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. My personal favorite is Circle of the Mountain, which gives you Spider Climb and Spike Growth. Read up on those to know why they're so incredible. Since Druids already have their subclass at this point, at level 3 all they gain is more spell slots, specifically 2nd level spell slots. Spell slots and spells themselves each have levels. What's important to understand is that a higher level spell cannot be cast using a lower level spell slot. However, a lower level spell can be cast using a higher level spell slot, and it usually powers it up in some way or another. The final portion of this video will encompass combat in Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition. At the start of combat, roll a d20 to determine your order in initiative. Then add your initiative bonus to that value. This will tell you what order people get to take their turns in. One round in Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition is canonically 6 seconds. It is finished when every character has taken their turn, and you return to the top of the initiative order. Unless stated otherwise, by features or some other aspect of your character, each character gets 1 action and 1 bonus action on their turn, to use however they please. When in combat, and in many other situations in D&D 5th Edition, you'll find yourself in a situation where you have either advantage or disadvantage. This refers to when you roll 2 d20s instead of just 1. With advantage, you take the higher of the 2 rolls. With disadvantage, you take the lower of the 2 rolls. Your action can be spent doing a variety of different things. In terms of melee combat, you can perform an attack, a grapple, a shove, a disengage, or a dash. When making a melee attack, you roll a d20 and add your modifiers. If that number that you end up with is higher than the AC of your target, or equal to it, your attack hits them. If you successfully hit a target, roll the damage dice for whatever weapon that you use to hit them with, plus any bonuses that you have at the time. In D&D 5th Edition, when you roll a 20 on your attack roll, you get an instant success. You also get to double the number of damage dice that you use with your weapon. However, in my groups we usually just double the total damage dealt by the weapon. It's up to you how you want to handle that. There aren't actually critical failures in D&D 5th Edition when you're attacking, but if you roll a 1, it is a guaranteed miss. However, at my table we would usually have it either deal 1 damage to us, hit an ally, or deal the full damage of the weapon to ourselves. When you are standing in a tile adjacent to an enemy character or NPC, you are considered in combat with that character. When you try and leave that space, they can make an opportunity attack to hit you just because you tried to move away. To prevent this, you can perform an action called a disengage, where you spend your action to prevent their ability to attack you. Some features stop this from being able to work. And lastly, you can also dash. This is when you spend your action to double your movement speed. When it comes to making attacks using spells in D&D 5th Edition, each spell is very unique. You'll need to determine how it behaves by reading the rules that apply to it. Here are some general concepts to keep in mind that apply to a very large number of spells. Range is a very common one, since many spells need to be lobbed at a target or shot from a distance. This will tell you how far away you can hit a target at. Components will tell you what is required to be able to perform the spell. There are verbal, somatic, and material components. Verbal implying that you need to be able to speak words to cast the spell, somatic implying that you need to be able to move your limbs to cast the spell, and material implying that you need some sort of object to cast the spell. Although generally, most people ignore the material components, but you should talk with your DM about how they feel about this rule. Like melee attacks, many spells have a chance to hit, so you need to challenge the target's armor class. For certain spells, you need to add your proficiency plus spellcasting modifier. In the case of druids, that's their wisdom modifier. Then roll a d20. Add these things together and compare it to the armor class of your target. Each spell, if applicable, will list its damage dice and damage type that's used to calculate the damage inflicted by the spell. The spell attack bonus modifier, listed at the top of the spellcasting list, gets added to your chance to hit rather than your damage. Some spells, rather than asking to roll against armor class, will have the target make a saving throw. Each spell will list the type of save that the target has to make. However, they will always have to beat what's called your spell save DC. This is equal to 8 plus proficiency plus your spellcasting modifier. In the case of druids, that's their wisdom modifier. Now you have everything you need to know to play Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition. I'm probably the person who sent you this video, so I hope to see you in game soon. Now get off my lawn.